Imagine a throne built not on power, not on conquest, but on blood twisted back upon itself, a throne where queens were not only mothers, but wives, where daughters were not only heirs, but brides. This is not a fable. It is not a story whispered to frighten children. It is history, documented, painted, and sealed within the royal archives of Europe. And what it reveals is a dynasty so warped by its own ambition that it slowly devoured itself from the inside. They called it tradition. They called it purity of blood. But beneath those words lay something darker, something that transformed a royal family into a portrait of decay, a queen who gave her body to her nephew, a daughter who became both child and wife, and a kingdom that believed this was the only way to keep the crown untouched by common hands. Tonight, we open the vault on the most inbred throne of Europe, and once you see what happened, you'll never look at royalty the same way again. The dynasty was ancient, stretching back centuries, each marriage calculated like a chess move. Bloodlines were guarded with more ferocity than borders, and the crown was treated not as a symbol, but as a possession. The Habsburgs, they were Europe's most powerful royal house, spreading their roots across Spain, Austria, and beyond. But their roots were not reaching outward. They were curling inward, twisting, choking the very tree they sprang from. Cousins married cousins, uncles took nieces, and when the old lines blurred, mothers became rivals to their own daughters for the love of the same men. They believed they were preserving God's chosen bloodline, but what they were creating was something fragile, cursed, and doomed to collapse. To outsiders, their portraits looked regal, untouchable, but if you stared long enough, you'd notice it. The long jaw, the sagging lip, the strangely vacant eyes. Generations of folding the same blood back into itself left marks that no crown could hide. And behind closed doors, the family's rituals of marriage, breeding, and betrayal produced children who were not heirs, but living reminders of what obsession with purity can do to a people. The story we're about to unravel centers on one queen, a woman who was both daughter and bride, whose existence was less about love and more about legacy. Her throne was built not on stone but on the bones of her own family tree, and through her we see the true cost of keeping power at any price. She was born into a palace where love was irrelevant, where every smile was measured, every touch accounted for, every child planned like the placement of a pawn on a board. From the moment of her first breath, her future had already been written. She was not her own. She belonged to the bloodline, and the bloodline demanded loyalty not just through duty, but through the flesh. The Habsburg family, that ancient dynasty, believed in something they called limpiezza de sangre, purity of blood. But purity, in their eyes, meant closing doors instead of opening them. Marriage was not a union of hearts, but a cage where brother met sister, uncle took niece, and cousins repeated the cycle again and again until it became the air everyone inside the palace breathed. The queen in question was Mariana of Austria, a woman who would become both the guardian and the victim of this system. She was just 15 when she was forced to marry her uncle, King Philip IV of Spain, a man nearly 30 years her senior. To the world outside, it was called a royal union. To her, it was submission to a tradition older than her name. He was her uncle, her father's brother, and now he was her husband. What choice did she have? There was no escape from the corridors of the Escorial Palace, no rebellion against centuries of decrees written in blood. At her wedding feast, courtiers praised the strength of their union, but no one spoke of the quiet terror that must have lived inside her, the horror of knowing she was now both niece and wife. And then came the daughter, born of a man who was her father and her uncle, born of a woman who was both child bride and queen. This daughter, Margaret Theresa, was not only the product of incest, she was destined to repeat it. She too was raised not to dream, not to love, but to preserve. Her mother, Mariana, knew what was expected. Her little girl would one day, Margaret Theresa, the daughter of Mariana and Philip, became the jewel of Spain's court, not for her laughter or her childhood innocence, but because she embodied the dynasty's future. Every brushstroke of her portrait was meant to remind Europe that the Habsburgs still reigned supreme, still untouchable. You may have seen her face before without realizing it. Diego Velázquez painted her again and again, capturing her as a fragile doll in layers of silk, surrounded by servants who bowed lower than the floor itself. She was 5, 6, 7 years old, but already the subject of bargaining tables, already a pawn in a marriage that was never hers to decide. Her uncle awaited her hand, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, who was both her mother's cousin and her own uncle. To the Habsburgs, this was destiny. To Margaret Theresa, it was a sentence. Even as a child, her life narrowed toward one inevitability. She would be offered to family, to preserve what had already been cracked beyond repair. It was a decision made while she still played with dolls, one she had no power to refuse. And yet history preserves her not only in paintings, but in whispers. Visitors to the Spanish court described her as beautiful, delicate, almost ethereal. But beneath the surface was a fragility not merely of the body, but of the blood. Generations of inbreeding had already begun to write their curse into her veins. Her father, King Philip IV, suffered from the infamous Habsburg jaw, a deformity so severe that eating and speaking became labored tasks. Doctors wrote that his seed was weak, his blood thinned. And now, Margaret Theresa, his daughter, his niece, was to be bound to another Habsburg, tightening the noose around their family tree. But if there is tragedy in her story, it is not simply that she was given away to a man who was her uncle. It is that she knew nothing else. To her, this was not horror. It was normality, a script written before she could even speak. A throne built on incest does not see itself as corrupted, it sees itself as divine. And that is the cruelest trick of all. Margaret Theresa would grow up believing she was chosen by God, when in reality she was chosen by the grave logic of a dynasty consuming its own children. The death of Margaret Theresa did not free the Habsburgs from their curse, it deepened it. With each generation the blood grew weaker, the bodies more fragile, the children less likely to live past infancy. The Spanish court became a mausoleum of hope, filled with sickly heirs who stumbled through their duties like ghosts. And at the very center of this decline stood one figure who has come to embody the price of the dynasty's obsession. Charles II of Spain, the son of Queen Mariana, the boy known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Charles was the half-brother of Margaret Theresa, born of the same Mariana of Austria who had once been forced to wed her own uncle. But Charles was not just a child of incest, he was its ultimate consequence. His face bore the Habsburg jaw to an extreme no painter could disguise. His body was frail, his growth stunted, his mind plagued by seizures and confusion. He was said to have teeth that could not meet to chew food, a tongue too large for his mouth, and a body so fragile he could barely stand without help. And yet, this broken boy was placed upon the throne of one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world. Foreign envoys wrote of him with barely veiled horror. They said his gaze seemed vacant, his speech impossible to follow. They whispered that his deformities were the punishment of God, a curse for centuries of bloodlines folded in on themselves. And in a sense, they were right. Charles II was not cursed by witches or spirits. He was cursed by his own family's choices, by a dynasty that worshipped its own blood until the blood itself became poison. But even Charles was not spared the cruel cycle. They forced him into marriage twice, desperate for an heir. Both unions were barren, both wives left childless, staring into the same abyss of inevitability. With Charles, the Habsburg line in Spain ended, not with a crown passed on, but with silence, with extinction. The throne that had once commanded half the known world crumbled, not because of war, not because of invasion, but because the family devoured itself from within. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have obeyed the tradition, or would you have broken it, even if it meant betraying your crown? The haunting irony is that while the Habsburgs believed they were preserving their divine right, what they preserved instead was weakness, deformity, and despair. The grandeur of their palaces, The shimmering crowns, the tapestries and feasts, all of it was camouflage for a family line collapsing in on itself. Behind gilded doors, servants carried rumors like ghosts of a king who could not eat, of queens who gave birth to children too frail to breathe, of a bloodline so cursed it seemed less human with each passing generation. The obsession with purity did not bind their empire together, it fractured it. Spain, once feared across the globe, sank into decline as its rulers became incapable of leading. The Habsburg jaw became a grotesque symbol of their vanity, a deformity sculpted not by nature, but by deliberate choice. Physicians who studied the family's records centuries later discovered something chilling. Over 80% of their marriages had been between close relatives. Geneticists now estimate that Charles II carried as much inbreeding as the child of a brother and sister. His DNA was not a tapestry, it was a knot, tangled beyond repair. And yet this was not just a matter of science. It was psychological horror, lived out in silks and shadows. Imagine being born into this family, knowing from the cradle that your body was not your own, that your marriage would be arranged not for love, but for blood, that the person who raised you could one day become your spouse. Every royal child was a prisoner of a system that disguised abuse as duty, incest as holiness, and decay as destiny. When the Spanish Habsburgs finally collapsed, the world did not mourn them. It recoiled. Their fall was not the loss of a dynasty, but the inevitable end of a family that had strangled itself with its own rules. Yet the portraits remain, their painted eyes staring back at us across centuries, daring us to confront the truth, that even the most powerful can destroy themselves when they worship blood more than life. And in those portraits, Mariana, Philip, Margaret Theresa, Charles II, we do not just see royalty, we see the cost of obsession, the faces of children raised to be sacrifices, the victims of a family that mistook incest for immortality. This is where the story leaves the palace and enters our own minds. Because the Habsburgs are not just a relic of Europe's past, they are a mirror. They remind us that power, when clutched too tightly, becomes poison. That families, when bound by control instead of love, can turn inward until they consume themselves. The Habsburgs simply lived this on a stage so grand, so grotesque, that history could not look away. But if you strip away the crowns and the titles, the pattern feels disturbingly familiar. How many families have destroyed themselves with secrets, binding their children to choices they never asked for? How many dynasties, whether royal or ordinary, have crumbled because the fear of losing control outweighed the need to protect their own blood? The Habsburgs took it to an extreme, sealing their fate in the twisted roots of their family tree. But the echoes of their story linger in every whispered tale of abuse, every family name carried down through generations, stained with silence. When Mariana gave her body to her uncle, when Margaret Theresa was handed to hers, when Charles II was placed on a throne he could not bear, these were not just political moves. They were acts of violence hidden beneath velvet robes. They were sacrifices of children at the altar of power. And what was gained? A line of kings who could not rule, a bloodline that could not survive, a dynasty that ended in silence. The lesson is not simply about royalty, it is about the danger of worshipping legacy above humanity, purity above compassion, tradition above truth. The Habsburgs remind us that when families refuse to break the cycle breaks them instead. Their portraits hang in museums now, silent and still. Visitors pass by, marveling at the silks, the crowns, the painted glory. But if you stare long enough into those eyes, you'll see it, the fear, the fragility, the quiet aura of children who were never allowed to be children. And that is the most unsettling truth of all. The most inbred throne of Europe was not destroyed by outsiders. It was undone from within, one generation at a time, one child at a time, until there was nothing left but ghosts in royal clothing,